It's been a while since I've done one of these, about a week. I kind of wanted to change things up. I want to make these more meaningful, more quality-based, and dive deeper into, my reflections on life and everything, rather than a preaching standpoint, because I think that reflections are so much more powerful. So this week, my history professor assigned the entire class an in-class essay, and we have the opportunity to prepare for it outside of class. But I wanted to explore one of them. It's kind of just like we go into class and we don't know which one it's going to be, but we're prepared for all of them, so we can take on whichever one it is because we prepare outside of class. But the question is, some analysts believe your generation would never be able to sacrifice both at home and overseas the way the World War II generation did. Some have called that generation the greatest. Do you agree? This is a huge question, and I'm almost concerned that the way that I answer it, my professor is not really going to appreciate. He's an easygoing guy, which is cool. He's very understanding, but the way I'd approach it is from a collective understanding, and how back in World War II, propaganda brought young men to basically believe that fighting for one's own country was an honorable act. And it's interesting because, I suppose many could argue that, for whatever reason, they were the greatest generation. But what I'd rather do is come at it from a neutral standpoint and realize that collectively you can kind of, especially in a manipulative sense, be bought into the idea, especially from a groupthink standpoint. It's a similar idea in terms of Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, the professor from University of Toronto, was recently talking on a podcast about how if we were back in the times of Nazi Germany, and in that collective perspective, we would potentially be Nazis. So in the sense that World War II happened and the propaganda happened and being bought into that happened in that time, and times now are different, and the matter of what's important now is different. We're looking at a planet that's being abused, and it's interesting because our focus, I think that a lot of people would look at something like war and kind of, instead turn towards peace or towards the environment, because we're realizing that to a great extent we've really destroyed this planet with our many unconscious acts. And what may have been important back then may no longer really be as important now, especially as we have a great understanding for the propaganda that was happening back then, and for PTSD, for instance. We're realizing now that human beings aren't meant to experience war. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a byproduct, an absolutely terrifying byproduct of that. We're not meant to see the terrors of that kind of stuff. I suppose that you could argue, well, we watch, horror films and all these violent, different forms of media, and, I suppose that's true and everything, but experiencing it firsthand in person is very different, as I can only imagine. But with that said, the only reason why I wouldn't call it the greatest generation is because back then their idea for what was so-called important was a different collective understanding. And for us now, what we're realizing through learning from those past experiences is that, there are things like PTSD. There are things like realizing that, you know, the killing of other human beings is just ridiculous, you know, because we're coming to more of an understanding these days now that we are all one, you know, that there's no separation, and that it's not necessary to carry out such acts. And I think that we're more focused on creating a sense of peace in humanity, and we're more focused on the environment and cleaning that up after all the unconscious destruction we've created in it, which is truly unfortunate, which we definitely are turning around now. But, you know, you could ask the same question, oh, well, you know, the young generations, the generations that are coming after us, the ones that are going to save the planet, because their focus is in a different place, and what I would argue as a better place, you know, what would it make them the greatest generation or the better generation? And I think that that's something that we need to take honestly and into consideration, you know, especially regarding this question. I think that the greatest generation out there is the generation itself, to utilize things like self-awareness on a very personal, individual, and even expanding to societal level. You know, awareness for the environment and our connection to it, so that we stop destroying it. And I think that this whole idea of, you know, sacrifice is just kind of vague, because in terms of, you know, like violence and stuff, we shouldn't have to, you know, sacrifice our lives, really. Instead, we should discover this deep, beautiful connection between all of us, this interconnectedness that has always existed and always will exist between all of us, and between us and the environment, you know, the nature from which we came, the nature of which we shall remain. It's a beautiful thing to think about.